worst part was not the silence. It was the way everyone pretended not to hear it. Elena Hartwell stood at the center of the mating circle, bare feet pressing against cold stone white linen dress, catching the draft that moved through the open columns of Thornridge Great Hall. The fabric whispered against her legs with each small shift of weight, a sound so quiet it should have been lost in the vastness of the chamber. But in the particular hush that had settled over the assembly, even that whisper felt too loud. Candles burned in iron rings suspended from the vaulted ceiling 20 feet above her head. The scent of cedar resin and crushed marigold drifted thick from the ceremonial braziers positioned at each corner of the room, coating the back of her throat with a sweetness that had stopped being pleasant somewhere around the second hour of standing. Around her, packed into tiered galleries, carved directly from the mountain stone and arranged in concentric circles that rose toward the shadows, sat nearly 300 wolves, elders in their formal robes of deep burgundy and forest green. Pack members in their best cloth, cleaned and pressed for an occasion that happened only once every 3 years. Visiting dignitaries from territories as far as 5 days' ride to the south and west, their unfamiliar scents marking them as outsiders even before their voices did. Unmated betas sitting straight-backed in the lower galleries, their expressions carefully neutral. And the alphas, 11 of them, this cycle who had traveled through early autumn cold and the first threat of mountain snow to witness what the pack laws still called, in language unchanged for 200 years, the presentation. She had counted herself lucky once to be chosen for this. The mating ceremony of the Thornridge pack happened every 3 years, timed to the autumn equinox, when the barrier between what was and what might be grew thin enough for the wolf to recognize its match. Women of eligible age and appropriate bloodline presented themselves before the gathered alphas. The alphas walked the circle in careful rotation, moving from woman to woman with the deliberate slowness of men making decisions that would shape the rest of their lives. If a bond stirred, if the scent elaned in that particular way that had no name in any human language, if the wolf itself recognized something essential in the person standing before them, the alpha placed a hand over the woman's mark, that hollow at the left shoulder, where the bond would settle and the pairing began. It was not romantic in any modern sense of the word. There were no declarations, no kneeling, no promises exchanged in flowery language that meant less with each repetition. It was ancient, formal, deeply tied to bloodline law and pack governance in ways that made it more contract than courtship, more strategy than sentiment. But Elena had grown up believing in it anyway. Her mother had found her mate at 17 in a circle just like this one, standing on these same stones, breathing this same incense-thick air. Her aunt had found hers at 22 and had told the story so many times that Elena could recite it from memory, complete with the pauses for dramatic effect, and the small laugh that always came when describing her uncle's expression as he realized what his wolf had chosen for him. The ceremony was supposed to mean something. It was supposed to mean her. She was 24 now. She had waited through 2 full cycles standing in this circle twice before while the alphas walked past their wolves, silent, their hands remaining at their sides. 3 ceremonies, 3 chances. That was what pack law allowed. After the third, an unmated woman of common bloodline was released from the ceremony rotation and assigned what the elders called, in their careful bureaucratic language, a contracted union, a practical arrangement, bloodless and chosen by the council of elders without consultation from the woman involved. She would have no say in the match, no right of refusal, no space to negotiate the terms of a life that would no longer be entirely her own. She would become someone's obligation, someone's household manager, someone's solution to a problem she had not created and could not fix. But this time felt different. This time she had reason to hope. Marcus Thorne had told her so himself. He had come to her 2 nights before the ceremony, standing in the narrow kitchen of the house she shared with her aunt, smelling of pine and the cold night air that came down from the high peaks this time of year. He was tall, broad through the shoulder, in the way of men who had done physical work their entire lives, a mid-ranking alpha from the Thornridge inner circle. Not the most powerful man in the room by any measure, but solid, respected. The kind of man who filled a doorway well and spoke with the particular confidence of someone who had never once doubted their place in the world. He had looked at her with those gray eyes that reminded her of winter sky over snow, and he had said the words she had been holding close to her chest ever since turning them over in her mind during the long hours when sleep would not come. "I've been thinking about you all summer, Elena. I'm going to find you in the circle. I want it to be you." She had not slept well in the 2 days since, not from fear, from something closer to the quiet electricity of a door finally opening after years of standing in front of it, wondering if the handle would ever turn. So she stood straight, now shoulders back, the way her aunt had taught her, breathing slowly through her nose to keep the incense from making her dizzy. She kept her hands loose at her sides, resisting the urge to clench them into fists or press them against the nervous flutter in her stomach. The alphas began their walk. There were 11 of them this cycle, which was a good number, her aunt had said. Enough for real choice, not so many that the evening would stretch past midnight. Elena tracked them without turning her head, a skill she had learned in her previous ceremonies. Listening to the shift of their boots on stone, the low murmur that went through the crowd when a pairing bond flared and an alpha stopped before one of the other women in the circle. 2 stops in the first rotation, both in the eastern quarter of the circle where the younger women stood. Then a third accompanied by a soft, collective exhale from the galleries, the kind of sound that meant the match was unexpected but not unwelcome. The scent of recognition rose briefly near the south pillar, a warm spike of something between wood smoke and rain-washed earth. A woman named Dara made a sound that was half surprise and half surrender, and someone in the upper gallery began to applaud before remembering themselves and stopping abruptly. Elena kept breathing, slow and steady, in through the nose, through the mouth. Her mother's earrings, small silver hoops, that had been the last gift before the fever took her, pressed cool against her neck when she turned her head slightly to track the movement near the west wall. She heard Marcus's stride before she saw him. She knew the rhythm of it by now after a summer of walking beside him at pack gatherings after evenings spent in carefully chaperoned conversation in her aunt's sitting room. He favored his left leg slightly. Not enough to be called a limp, but enough that his gait had a particular unevenness to it, a habit born from an old knee injury he never mentioned but always carried. The sound of his boots on the stone floor had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. He was approaching from the east arc of the circle, moving with that same steady, unhurried pace she had come to associate with him. She did not turn. Protocol demanded that the women remain facing forward, eyes on the far wall, where a tapestry of a silver wolf running beneath a full moon hung in a place of honor, the threads worn thin at the edges from decades of ceremony smoke and the touch of time. The wolf in the tapestry ran and got nowhere, frozen mid-stride for as long as Elena had been alive, and probably longer. Marcus's footsteps grew closer. She could smell him now, that particular combination of pine and leather, and something deeper. Something that was just him, the scent that marked him as surely as his name. Her heart kicked hard against her ribs. This was it. This was the moment she had been waiting for through 2 ceremonies and countless nights of wondering if she would spend her life in a match chosen by strangers. He passed her, not paused, not hesitated, passed. His boots moved without breaking rhythm, carrying him past her position in the circle as if she were simply another stone in the floor, another piece of architecture to navigate around on his way to somewhere else. His scent did not change. There was no amber warmth of recognition, no shift in the air that marked the moment when a wolf found what it had been searching for. No hand reaching for her left shoulder. Just air, and then his back, and then the space where he had been. For a moment, she thought she had miscounted. The chamber was large, the acoustics strange sound bouncing off stone in ways that could make distances deceptive. She thought perhaps she had confused his footsteps for someone else's, that he was still approaching from a different direction, that her wolf sense had failed her in the way it sometimes did when she was nervous or tired or standing in a room full of competing scents. She turned her head just slightly, breaking protocol because the alternative was standing there in deliberate ignorance, and she saw him. Saw Marcus stop 4 positions to her left. Saw his hand come up in the gesture she had been imagining for 2 days, that reaching motion that meant this one mind chosen. Saw it settle with absolute certainty on the shoulder of the woman standing where Elena was not. Mira Vale, blonde 19 years old, newly presented at her first ceremony. The daughter of a family that held significant land in the northern quarter, well connected in ways that Elena's family had never been. The crowd exhaled in collective approval, a sound like wind through late autumn leaves. Mira made a breathless sound that carried in the sudden, quiet surprise and joy and relief all tangled together in a way that Elena recognized because she had imagined making that exact sound herself. Marcus's hand stayed where it was, confirming the bond, and the formal weight of pack law settled over the moment like a benediction. Elena turned back to the tapestry with its running silver wolf. The wolf ran and got nowhere, and she understood that suddenly. Understood it in a way she had not when she was younger, and still believed that effort and hope and doing everything right would eventually result in movement forward instead of this endless, frozen stride. She did not cry in the hall. She did not cry in the antechamber where the paired couples were led for the formal recognition ceremony. She did not cry in the long corridor that connected the great hall to the outer courtyard, even though the stone walls there would have swallowed the sound and kept it private. She did not cry in the courtyard itself, where the evening air smelled of turned earth and dying marigolds from the window boxes 3 stories up. She made it to the outer wall before her knees decided they were no longer interested in cooperating with the rest of her, and she sat down on the low stone bench beside the garden gate and pressed her hands flat against her thighs and focused on the simple mechanical act of breathing. The sounds of the ceremony celebration drifted over the wall. Someone had started the pipes, that high, thin, reedy sound that always accompanied formal pack gatherings. There was laughter. There was always laughter at a successful mating. Joy was expected. Joy was required. Joy was the appropriate response to watching other people find what you had been hoping for yourself. I'm going to find you in the circle. I want it to be you. She pressed her teeth together and thought about every moment she had spent since that night in her aunt's kitchen, replaying those words, examining them from every angle like a jeweler checking a stone for flaws. The way she had allowed herself to believe them to build a future in her mind that included Marcus's gray eyes and steady presence and the life they might have made together. The way she had washed her hair twice the morning of the ceremony using the good soap her aunt saved for special occasions, taking care with the details as if attention to small things might somehow influence large ones. The earrings. She had spent an embarrassing amount of time selecting which earrings were appropriate for a formal pairing, finally settling on the small silver hoops her mother had left her because they were simple and elegant and had the weight of family history behind them. She had wanted to look like someone worth choosing. She pulled the earrings out, now one and then the other, the small silver hoops catching the last of the evening light as she held them in her palm. They were warm from her skin, small circles of heat against her cold hand. Above the wall, someone cheered. Marcus was probably laughing. Mira was probably glowing with that particular radiance that came from being chosen from standing in a circle and having someone's wolf say yes. You, out of everyone here, you are the one. The garden gate creaked. Elena did not look up immediately. She expected a servant slipping out for air, or a child escaping the noise and formality of the hall, or perhaps one of the older pack members who found the long ceremonies as exhausting as she did. But the footsteps that followed the creak of the gate were not hurried or apologetic. They were slow, deliberate, carrying the particular weight of someone who walked like they had never once needed to justify being anywhere. A dark cloak settled into the edge of her vision, just at the periphery where her eyes could register presence without committing to actual observation. She looked up because ignoring someone standing 3 feet away seemed like more effort than acknowledgement, and also because some small part of her, the part that had been trained from childhood in pack courtesy and proper behavior, could not quite bring itself to be rude even now. She did not know him, that was the first thing. And in a pack gathering of this size in this territory, attended by nearly every significant wolf family within 4 days' ride, not knowing someone was itself a kind of information. He was tall, broader through the shoulder than Marcus, though he wore it differently. Not like something displayed a physical attribute he had decided to make central to his identity, but like something simply true, a fact of his existence that required no particular emphasis. Dark hair shorter on the sides in a style that suggested military discipline or perhaps just impatience with anything requiring maintenance. A jaw that looked like it had been argued into existence by someone with strong opinions about severity and male beauty. His eyes, when they found hers in the weak light of the garden torches, were the specific gray of deep water before a storm. Not cold exactly, not warm either. Just present in a way that made the air around her feel slightly more defined, as if his attention had the physical weight of a hand pressed against her shoulder. He was not wearing ceremony colors. His cloak was plain dark wool traveling weight, the kind of thing someone wore when they had miles to cover and weather to contend with. The ring on his right hand was heavy silver with a seal she could not make out from this distance, but the quality of it was unmistakable. This was not decorative jewelry. This was a signet worn by someone who used it for its intended purpose. He looked at her sitting on the stone bench with her earrings in her palm and her white dress slightly dusty at the hem from where it had dragged across the floor of the hall. And he did not look away with that particular courtesy that people employed to avoid acknowledging other people's humiliation. He did not glance off to the side or find something fascinating in the middle distance, or suddenly develop intense interest in the state of his boots. He looked at her the way someone looked at a problem they had already decided to take seriously. The ceremony is still running, he said. His voice was low, unhurried, not unkind, the kind of voice that did not need to be raised to carry authority. I'm aware, Elena said. Her own voice came out steady, which surprised her. She had thought it might crack or waver or betray her in one of the dozen small ways that voices could betray their owners, when control was a thin thing held together by will alone. A pause. He did not fill it with anything performative. No sympathetic noises, no platitudes about how there would be other ceremonies or other chances or whatever kind words strangers offered when they stumbled across someone else's private devastation. He simply waited, which was somehow worse than if he had offered empty comfort and left. "Were you in the circle?" he asked. She considered lying. The lies were available, lined up in her mind like clothes in a wardrobe, ready to be selected and worn. She was a servant who had slipped away from her duties. She was a visiting dignitary's companion who had come out for air. She was no one of consequence, and this was not a story worth telling. But the lies required energy she did not have, and the truth was so heavy in her chest that keeping it there seemed harder than letting it out. "Third and final," she said. Something moved in his expression, not pity. She had braced for pity in the way she might brace for a blow, and she was prepared to meet it with coldness, to freeze him out the way ice froze over a pond in winter, making the surface hard and impenetrable. But this was not pity. This was something else. Recognition, perhaps. Or attention genuinely redirected, shifted from whatever had brought him out to this garden, and focused entirely on her in a way that felt both uncomfortable and strangely grounding. "I see," he said. "It happens," Elena said, because it did. Because she refused to perform devastation for a stranger, refused to give him the kind of emotional display that would allow him to walk away, feeling like he had witnessed something profound when what he had actually witnessed was just another woman running out of chances. He was quiet for a moment. Above the wall, the pipes shifted into something slower, more complex, celebratory, and mournful at once, in the way that pipe music often managed to be both things simultaneously. "Are you going back inside?" he asked. "Eventually." He nodded once, a small downward motion of his head that suggested he found this reasonable, and then he did something she genuinely did not expect. He sat down, not close. There were several feet of stone bench between them, enough space for 3 people to sit comfortably, if such people materialized, but deliberately, with the specific intention of remaining rather than passing through. He folded his hands in his lap and looked out at the dark garden where the last marigolds were folding closed against the cold that came down from the mountains as soon as the sun set. Elena stared at the side of his face for a moment, genuinely confused by this turn of events. Strange men did not sit in gardens with women they did not know. Strange men certainly did not sit in gardens with women who had just been publicly passed over at a mating ceremony. There were rules about this, unwritten, perhaps, but no less binding for their lack of formal codification. Rules about what was appropriate, what was expected. What would not cause talk among people who had nothing better to do than speculate about the private lives of others. "You don't have to stay," she said. "I know," he said. She looked back at her earrings still warm in her palm, though the heat was fading now, leaching away into the cold air. She closed her fingers around them, feeling the metal crescents press into her palm. The metal was cooling to losing the warmth of her body, becoming just metal again, rather than the small piece of her mother she carried with her always. She did not know his name. She did not know why he was here outside a ceremony that everyone in his apparent position should have been attending, sitting on a bench in a garden, with a woman who had just been publicly rejected for the 3rd time in 6 years. But the garden was quiet and the stone was cold, and for reasons she could not have articulated to anyone's satisfaction, including her own, she did not ask him to leave. Inside, someone cheered. The sound was muffled by stone and distance, but it carried enough to be recognizable as joy. Marcus was probably laughing. Mira was probably glowing. The elders were probably already discussing bloodline implications and territory alliances, and all the practical matters that made a match more than just 2 people deciding they could tolerate each other's company. Elena sat with her earrings in her fist and a stranger at the far end of her bench, and the night came down around them like something patient in no hurry to be anywhere else. She did not know yet that the man sitting beside her in the dark had arrived at Thornridge that morning with a delegation of 12. She did not know that the seal on his ring was the mark of the Northern Sovereign, or that his name was K.L. Ashford, or that he had watched the entire ceremony from the upper gallery where visiting dignitaries of significant rank were seated. She did not know that he had followed her out here, deliberately tracking her movement through the halls with the particular attention of someone who had seen something that required investigation. She learned his name by accident, the way you learned most things that mattered. It was Elder Margot Blackwood who said it. Sharp-faced woman with silver-streaked hair, pulled back in a style that was more military than fashionable, who moved through the Thornridge corridors the following morning like she owned the walls and merely tolerated the people inside them. Elena had been crossing the main hall on her way to collect her traveling bag, already rehearsing the quiet dignity with which she intended to leave Thornridge before the contracted union paperwork arrived when Margot swept past with 2 other elders at her heels. "The delegation leaves at midday, Lord K.L., Margot said, without slowing her, always carrying in the particular way that voices carried when their owners were accustomed to being heard and obeyed. The pack council expects your answer before then. She was not speaking to Elena. She was speaking to the man walking 3 steps behind her, tall and broad-shouldered, in traveling clothes, the same man who had sat with Elena in the garden the night before. Elena stopped walking because the alternative was continuing forward and pretending she had not heard, and she had reached her limit for pretending. Margot and her companions disappeared around the far corridor without acknowledging Elena's presence. The man turned his head, and their eyes met across 15 feet of cold stone floor. He had the specific composure of someone who had been recognized before in contexts like this, someone who had made peace with whatever it meant to have their name spoken in hallways by people who expected compliance. Elena turned and walked in the opposite direction, back toward the guest quarters where her bag waited. Her heart was doing something complicated in her chest, a rhythm that felt less like beating and more like stumbling. She knew the name. Everyone in the Northern Territories knew the name. Cale Ashford, Alpha King of the Black Pine Sovereignty, the largest consolidated wolf territory in the northern half of the continent. He had held the title for 7 years, inheriting it at 26 after his father's death in a hunting accident that had never been fully explained to anyone's satisfaction. He had spent those 7 years doing exactly what Alpha Kings did, expanding borders through alliance rather than bloodshed, building trade agreements that made his territory wealthy, earning the kind of reputation that made packs like Thornridge invite him to ceremonies and hope he would be impressed enough to remember them favorably. He was not supposed to be sitting in gardens with rejected women. Elena reached the side courtyard where the traveling horses were being prepared, their breath visible in the cold morning air, their tack creaking as stable hands made final adjustments. She found the stable boy who had been holding her aunt's mare and was in the process of checking the saddle straps with more attention than the task strictly required when she heard boots on the courtyard stones behind her. "You're leaving," Cale said, not a question. An observation delivered in that same low, unhurried voice. "Before midday," Elena said pleasantly, not turning around, keeping her hands busy with leather and buckles and the small mechanical tasks that required enough attention to be a valid excuse for not making eye contact. "Same as your delegation, different direction most likely." A pause. She tightened the strap, checked it again, gave herself something to do while her mind worked through the implications of an Alpha King tracking her down in a stable yard. "There's a matter I'd like to discuss with you," he said. She turned then because ignoring an Alpha King in a stable yard felt like exactly the kind of situation that compounded itself, that started small and grew into something with consequences she did not want to navigate. He stood in the low morning light, his cloak exchanged now for a dark riding jacket that fit him well enough to have been tailored specifically for his frame. The seal ring caught dull gold from the hay-filtered sun coming through gaps in the stable roof. He looked, if anything, more authoritative by daylight than he had by torchlight, which she resented on principle. "Lord Cale," she said with the precise courtesy her aunt had spent years installing in her, the kind that was both respectful and distant. "I'm a woman with a contracted union arriving in my near future and no particular standing in this territory. I can't imagine what matter I could possibly offer you." "That's the matter," he said. She waited. Years of living in a pack had taught her that silence was often more effective than questions, that people would fill empty air if you gave them enough of it. He did not look uncomfortable. He looked like a man who had made a decision and was now proceeding through it with the same energy he brought to everything else, direct and unhurried, and resolved in a way that suggested he had considered all available options and selected this one as optimal. "I have 2 children," he said. "Twins. A boy and a girl. They are 5 years old. Their mother, Celeste, passed during a fever outbreak in the 3rd winter of their lives. They have been without a consistent maternal presence for 3 years. Elena went very still. This was not where she had expected the conversation to go. This was not about pack alliances or trade agreements or whatever political matters Alpha Kings typically discussed with women they had met exactly once in a garden. "I have a household of capable staff," Cale continued, "and a pack of considerable size and resources. What I do not have is someone the children respond to in any sustained way. I have tried 4 arrangements in 3 years. None have held." He paused, and in that pause, Elena heard all the things he was not saying. The desperation that must have preceded trying 4 different people to care for his children. The toll that 3 years of instability had taken on 2 small humans who had lost their mother before they were old enough to have solid memories of her. The weight of being a sovereign who could command armies but could not solve the problem of 2 grieving children. "Last night," he said, "I watched you sit in a garden alone after something painful, and you refused to perform grief for a stranger. That is not a small thing. Most people, when they're hurting, either hide it completely or display it as a form of currency, something they can spend to buy sympathy or attention or whatever it is they think they need from other people. You did neither. You simply sat with it. The mare shifted behind her warm breath at the back of her neck, patient in the way of horses who had learned that humans took time to reach conclusions. You're describing a position, Elena said carefully, a household role, with your children. A formal one, he said, with title compensation, protected status within Black Pine territory, and full dissolution rights after 1 year if the arrangement does not suit either party. You would not be a servant. You would not be under anyone's authority except mine, and I have no interest in authority for its own sake. The children need someone. I think you might be someone they could accept. And I think you need a place where your value is not determined by a ceremony that has failed you 3 times. Elena looked at him for a long moment. The morning moved around them with a particular quality of time that felt suspended, stretched thin by the weight of decisions being made. A groom passed with a water bucket, his footsteps loud on the cobblestones. The distant sound of the pack bell marking the hour. Wood smoke threading down from the kitchens 3 stories up. "Why me?" she said. It was not quite a question, more like a request for him to finish showing his reasoning to complete the logic that had led him from watching her in a garden to offering her what sounded suspiciously like a way out of the contracted union that waited for her back in Thornridge. "Because you stayed outside instead of going back in to pretend," he said. "And because when I sat beside you, you didn't ask me for anything. Most people, when they realize who I am, immediately start calculating what they can gain from my attention. You didn't. You just sat there with your grief and your dignity, and you asked nothing of me except that I not make it worse by offering empty comfort." She thought about that. She thought about Marcus and his gray eyes and his, "I want it to be you," about how little those words had turned out to weigh when measured against whatever had made him walk past her to Mira Vale. She thought about contracted unions and elders making decisions about her life without consulting her about small rooms in distant houses assigned to women who had run out of ceremonies. "I'd want to meet them first," she said. "The children." Something shifted behind his eyes. Not surprise exactly. Perhaps relief, which was a more interesting thing to see on a face like his on a man who commanded territories and made decisions that affected thousands of lives. "That's reasonable," he said. Black Pine Castle was 12 hours by coach from Thornridge, through 2 mountain passes and a long stretch of pine forest that smelled of cold resin and wet bark. The coach was well sprung, but the roads were rough this time of year, and Elena spent the journey in the second carriage with a woman named Petra Wolf. Petra was somewhere in her 50s, sturdy as a well-made table with the particular manner of someone who had been organizing catastrophes into schedules for 30 years and found the work satisfying. She was Kael's head housekeeper, she explained, and had been with the Ashford household since before Kael's father died, back when the castle had been run by someone who believed in formality and strict hierarchies. "Lord Kael is less interested in formality than his father was," Petra said, her hands folded neatly in her lap as the coach rocked over uneven ground. "He cares about results, whether things function properly, whether people are doing their jobs well. He does not care about whether you address him correctly or use the right fork at dinner, though I would prefer you use the right fork simply because it makes my life easier." Elena smiled despite herself. "I'll do my best." "The twins," Elena said somewhere in the second hour of forest, when the silence had stretched long enough to feel comfortable rather than awkward. "Tell me about them." Petra considered this with the seriousness it deserved, her eyes on the pine trees sliding past the window. "Rowan is louder," she said finally. "He has opinions about breakfast and will share them at length. He is also the one who cried for 4 days when the last arrangement ended, though he would deny it if asked. He is protective of his sister in the way of boys who understand, even at 5, that the world is not always kind to people who are quieter than they are." A pause. The coach wheels hit a particularly rough patch of road, and they both swayed with the movement. "Bryn is quiet," Petra continued. "She watches everything. She stopped speaking for nearly 2 months after her mother passed. She speaks now, but selectively. She likes dogs. She tolerates most adults. In 3 years, I have seen her voluntarily take someone's hand exactly once, and it was the kennel master's when one of the hounds was sick and she wanted to help." Elena absorbed this, watching the forest through her own window, the way the light came down through the branches in long golden shafts that looked solid enough to climb. "What happened with the previous arrangements?" she asked. "The first woman was afraid of Rowan's wolf instincts," Petra said, her voice matter-of-fact, not unkind. "He shifted partial at 4, which is early and startling if you're not prepared for it. Pause instead of hands, eyes that change color, a child's voice coming out wrong, because the vocal cords are trying to be 2 things at once. She left within a month." Elena said nothing. 4 was early for a partial shift. Most children did not manage it until 6 or 7, when they had enough control to understand what they were doing. The second was competent, Petra said, but she treated them like a professional obligation. Morning routine, afternoon lessons, evening meal, bed. Nothing wrong with any of it, but nothing right either. Bryn never looked at her directly, not once in 4 months. The third had genuine affection for Rowan, Petra said, but found Bryn's quiet unsettling. She kept trying to make the child talk as if silence were a problem to be solved rather than a choice to be respected. Bryn withdrew further. It lasted 2 months. And the fourth, Petra's expression adjusted by a fraction, a tightening around her mouth, that suggested this particular memory was less pleasant than the others. The fourth was selected by the council rather than by Lord Kale, she said, and it showed. She was well connected politically from a family that wanted closer ties to Blackpine, and the elders thought it would serve multiple purposes. Care for the children, strengthen an alliance, perhaps position herself as a potential mate for Lord Kale down the line. What happened? The children hated her, Petra said simply. Rowan refused to eat when she was in the room. Bryn stopped speaking entirely again, went back to that silence she had lived in after her mother died. Lord Kale ended it after 3 weeks. Elena looked at the older woman, at the careful neutrality in her expression. That was not quite neutrality, that was actually a kind of judgment delivered without words. The council wants Lord Kale to remate, Petra said, meeting her eyes directly for the first time since the conversation began. They have been patient by council standards, but patience has limits, and a sovereign without a bonded mate is a political vulnerability they find increasingly inconvenient. She smoothed her skirt with hands that had probably smoothed 1,000 skirts in 1,000 similar moments, a gesture that meant the difficult part of the conversation was coming. Several families have presented candidates over the past year, Petra continued. Appropriate bloodlines, political connections, women who would bring resources or alliances or status. Lord Kyle has declined each one. Why? The housekeeper looked at her for a moment, and Elena had the sense of being assessed, measured against some internal standard Petra had developed over 3 decades of managing a sovereign household. You'd have to ask him that, Petra said finally. But I will tell you this much. The children come first for him. Not the territory, not the council, not political advantage. The children. If they cannot accept someone, he will not force it, regardless of what it costs him politically. The coach hit another rough patch, and they both fell silent, watching the forest give way gradually to cultivated landfields lying fallow for the winter stone walls marking property boundaries that had probably stood for generations. Blackpine Castle appeared on the horizon as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks. Elena had prepared herself for grandeur in the cold, aggressive sense. The kind of architecture that existed primarily to remind you of your smallness, to make you feel the weight of history and power, and all the things that separated people who lived in castles from people who did not. What she found instead was a structure that had grown rather than been designed, built and rebuilt and added to across generations until it had the rambling, layered character of something genuinely lived in rather than merely inhabited. There were towers at the east and west ends, yes, and the main gate was imposing in the way that gates needed to be when they were the primary point of defense against whatever threats the mountains might send down. But the inner courtyard had a pear tree growing crooked against the south wall, its branches bare now, but positioned in a way that suggested someone had deliberately left it there rather than cutting it down to make room for something more symmetrical. The main steps were worn smooth from decades of boots tracking in and out the stone hollowed slightly in the centers where feet had fallen most often. And there beside the kitchen entrance, someone had left a small pair of muddy shoes. The shoes made her chest do something unexpected. A small, sharp twist that was not quite pain, but was definitely feeling the kind that arrived without permission and demanded acknowledgement. She was shown to a room in the east wing by a young woman whose name Elena immediately forgot, too focused on cataloging details to retain information about people. Not servant quarters, which would have been in the lower levels with smaller windows and less light. Not the formal guest suite which Petra had pointed out as they passed with its elaborate furnishings and the kind of art that existed to impress rather than please. But something between. A comfortable room with a window seat that overlooked the orchard, a writing desk positioned to catch the morning light, a washstand with clean linen folded beside it, and a bed with a dark green quilt that smelled faintly of cedar and lavender when she sat on it to test the mattress. Someone had put a small vase of late-season herbs on the windowsill. Sage and rosemary still green despite the cold, tied with a plain piece of twine. She did not know who. She did not ask. She had 20 minutes alone before the knock came. It was not Petra. The knock was too soft, too hesitant. The door barely opened and then stopped, held at a distance that suggested whoever was on the other side was reconsidering their decision to knock in the first place. The particular quality of silence that followed told her, before she saw anything, that whoever was out there was small and uncertain and gathering courage. "You can come in," she said, turning from the window where she had been watching the orchard and the mountains beyond. The door opened fully. The boy came first. He had to be Rowan. Dark-haired and wide-eyed, carrying the energy of someone who had made a decision and was committed to it, even though now that it was actually happening, he was not entirely sure it had been a good decision. He was small for 5, or perhaps exactly right for 5. Elena was not an expert in these matters. He had his father's jaw already sketched faintly in his face, the kind of bone structure that would be striking when he grew into it, but was currently just a promise of what he might become. There was a smear of something that might have been jam on his left wrist. Behind him, half inside the room and half still in the corridor, was the girl. Bryn had her mother's coloring, Elena guessed, though she had never seen Celeste, and was working purely from the contrast with her brother. Lighter hair that caught the afternoon sun coming through the window, lighter eyes, the kind of pale gray that shifted between silver and blue, depending on the angle of the light. She stood with her hands folded in front of her, a gesture that was too formal for a 5-year-old, too practiced. She looked at Elena with an expression of absolute unguarded assessment. No performance, no social smile meant to smooth over awkward moments. Just looking with the full weight of a child who had learned that people sometimes left and had developed strong opinions about whether new ones were worth the investment. Rowan said loudly enough that it filled the room. "Petra says you came from far." 12 hours, Elena said. He considered this with the seriousness of someone calculating vast distances. "Were there wolves in the forest?" "Probably," she said. "I didn't see any, but that's the thing about wolves. They see you first." Something shifted in Bryn's expression. Not quite a smile. Something more careful than that, more considered. A note of interest taken and filed away for later examination. Rowan stepped the rest of the way into the room and looked at the window seat with transparent desire. "Can I sit there?" he asked. "It's your house," Elena said. He beamed a full-face transformation from uncertain to delighted and climbed up onto the cushioned bench with the particular determination of small children navigating furniture designed for people twice their size. He arranged himself cross-legged and looked out at the orchard with the air of someone who had accomplished something significant. Bryn stayed in the doorway for another moment. Then, with the specific gravity of a decision made, after careful consideration, she walked into the room, crossed to the chair beside the writing desk, and sat on the very edge of it. She kept her hands folded. She kept her eyes on Elena. Elena sat on the floor beside the window seat, her back against the wall, arranging herself so that she was slightly below eye level with both of them. It was a deliberate choice, the kind that her aunt would have called unladylike and impractical. But something in her instincts said that looking up at children was better than having them look up at her, at least for this first meeting. From the doorway, she was aware, without looking directly, that someone else was present now. The particular quality of attention that came with being observed by someone who was very good at not being obvious about it. She did not look. She kept her eyes on the twins, on Rowan's rapid-fire questions about the forest and the horses, and whether she had ever seen a wolf fight, on Bryn's careful silence that was not absence of interest, but rather intense focus being expressed differently. It was only when Rowan finally ran out of steam, his questions winding down like a mechanical toy, losing momentum, slumping against the window seat cushions in the particular way of children who had used up their immediate store of social energy, that Elena looked toward the door. Kael stood just outside it, arms crossed, watching. Not supervising in the sense of checking to make sure she was doing something correctly. Just watching with the expression of a man who had seen something he was not entirely prepared for and was being honest with himself about that lack of preparation. He met her eyes. She looked back at the children, at Rowan's dark head resting against the cushion, at Bryn's careful posture on the chair. "I'll stay the month," she said to the room in general, to all of them or none of them, whichever seemed most appropriate. "And we'll see." The first week passed in the specific texture of careful adjustment, the way all new situations passed when everyone involved was watching everyone else for signs of disaster or success. Elena learned the rhythms of Black Pine Castle the way she had always learned difficult things quietly and through observation without announcing that she was paying attention. She learned that Rowan woke before sunrise and could be heard in the corridor outside her room conducting whispered arguments with himself about matters of great personal importance. Whether his boots went on before or after his shirt. Whether breakfast should include honey or jam, but never both because that was excessive. Whether the dog in the kennels, whose name was Bear, was actually the best dog or merely one of the best dogs, a distinction that apparently required extensive internal debate. She learned that Bryn ate breakfast with the precision of someone performing a ritual that had rules known only to her. Bread first broken into small pieces and eaten one at a time. Then fruit if there was fruit, always the same sequence, starting with whatever was least sweet and ending with whatever was most. Then whatever warm thing Petra had prepared, porridge or eggs, or occasionally something more elaborate if the cook was in an ambitious mood. Disrupting this sequence even accidentally by offering the fruit before the bread produced not a tantrum, but a silence so pointed it functioned as one, a withdrawal so complete that it took the rest of the meal to coax Bryn back into anything resembling engagement. She learned that the East Wing caught the morning light well, making it the preferred location for activities that required being able to see what you were doing. That the West Wing smelled faintly of old wood smoke from a fireplace that had not drawn properly in years, and that no one had bothered to fix because the rooms were mostly used for storage anyway. That the pear tree in the courtyard was Rowan's preferred climbing structure, despite Petra's repeated assertions that it was not meant to bear the weight of small boys, and Bryn's preferred reading location, a spot at its base where the roots had created a natural seat in the earth. She learned that Kyle took his meals with the twins at the long table in the family dining room, rather than in the formal hall, which she had not expected. Alpha Kings, in her limited experience, did not generally prioritize family dinners over the kind of political meals that required being seen and being impressive. But Kyle appeared every evening at 6 still in whatever he had been wearing for the day's work and sat at the head of the table while Rowan described his day in exhaustive detail, and Bryn watched them all with her careful assessing silence. And she learned that Kyle watched her with the children the way she had caught him watching from the doorway that first afternoon. Not intrusively, not with the evaluating quality of an employer assessing staff performance and checking boxes on an internal list, but with something quieter attention that had not yet decided what it was or what it meant, but that was present nonetheless, a weight she could feel even when she was not looking directly at him. She did not examine that too closely. What she focused on was Bryn. Rowan was not difficult, which was not the same as saying he was easy. He was loud and physical and direct in all his emotional communications, which made him exhausting in the way that honest things were exhausting, rather than the way deceptive things were. Everything he felt showed on his face immediately and without filter. Joy was full body and involved jumping. Sadness was tears that came fast and left just as fast once the problem was addressed. Frustration was a kind of whole system shutdown that required sitting very still until the feeling passed and he could figure out what to do about whatever had caused it. He wanted to show her things constantly. He wanted her to watch him climb to the top of the pear tree and balance on the thinnest branches that would hold his weight. He wanted her opinion on whether pine cones or acorns made better projectiles, a question he posed with the gravity of someone conducting serious scientific research. He brought her objects that required explanation. A beetle he had found near the garden wall, iridescent green and moving slowly across his palm. A piece of quartz with an interesting vein of darker mineral running through it. A drawing of a wolf he had made that was, in his words, extremely realistic. She looked at the drawing, which bore the kind of relationship to reality that all 5-year-old drawings bore, which was to say it had 4 legs and a tail. And that was about where the realism ended. Extremely realistic, she agreed gravely, and he had beamed at her and asked if she wanted to keep it. She did. It was pinned now to the wall above the writing desk in her room, held in place with a nail she had borrowed from the stable master, because Rowan had given it to her formally and with great ceremony, and she had accepted it in the same spirit. Bryn gave her nothing, not coldly. Elena had been prepared for cold and knew how to move around it, how to be patient in the face of a child's deliberate withdrawal. What Bryn gave her instead was something more like suspension, waiting. A stillness that said, I have seen people try before. I have seen them fail. I am watching to see what you do when it gets difficult, because it always gets difficult, and that is when people leave. Elena did not try to engineer connection. She had watched enough of the previous arrangements fail to understand that forcing affection was worse than useless, that it created the opposite of what it intended. Instead, she simply existed near the girl, reading in the same courtyard where Bryn read, choosing a spot close enough to be noticed, but far enough away to not be intrusive. Sitting at the same table during meals, responding when spoken to, but never pushing for conversation that Bryn did not initiate. Being present without demanding anything in return for that presence. She had learned from watching Rowan that Bryn tracked everything her brother did, and that what landed with him landed slightly differently with her, slower and more considered, but ultimately more permanent. Rowan's enthusiasms were bright and brief, burning hot, and then moving on to the next thing. Bryn's decisions once made seemed to be forever. On the 6th day, Bryn brought her a book. She did not announce it. She simply appeared beside Elena on the window seat, where Elena had been reading in the late afternoon light, and she set the book down on the cushion between them, without comment, and then she sat at the other end of the seat and opened her own book and began to read. It was a collection of old pack histories illustrated with careful ink drawings of significant moments and people. The kind of volume that cost more than most households kept in a year leather-bound and edged in gold leaf that had been applied with enough skill to suggest professional work. The pages were thick, made to last, and someone had marked several of them with small strips of cloth to indicate places of interest. Elena did not make a production of it. She opened the book to the first marked page and read about the founding of the Thornridge Pack 300 years ago, about the territorial disputes that had eventually led to the current boundary agreements, about the bloodlines that had intermarried, until the distinctions between families became less important than the collective identity of the pack itself. Bryn watched her for a moment, that same careful assessment Elena had seen in the doorway the first day. Then she looked back at her own book, and the afternoon settled into a comfortable quiet, broken only by the sound of pages turning and the distant noise of Rowan in the courtyard below explaining something to the gardener, with the kind of passionate intensity that suggested the gardener had not asked but was getting the explanation anyway. Elena felt something shift quietly in her chest, not dramatically, just a small adjustment like a door opening. Not flung wide, not thrown open with ceremony or announcement, just opening the way doors opened in houses where you had learned the weight of them, where you knew exactly how much pressure to apply to the handle and exactly how hard to push. It was Petra who told her about the council. 11 days in, during the early evening hour when the twins were with their tutor and the castle settled into its quieter register, the rhythm of dinner preparation and evening routines, creating a kind of background hum that was soothing in its predictability. Petra brought tea to Elena's room without being asked and sat across from her with the manner of a woman who had something to say and had decided the time had arrived. "The council meets in 3 days," Petra said, adding honey to her tea with careful precision. "Lord Kale has been summoned to give his formal response to the mating candidates they presented in the spring." Elena wrapped her hands around her cup, feeling the warmth seep into her palms. Outside her window, the light was failing in the particular way it failed in early winter. Fast and cold, the sun dropping behind the mountains and taking all the warmth with it. "That's pack governance," she said. "It doesn't concern me." "It does, rather," Petra said. She had the kind of voice that managed to be gentle and implacable at the same time, the voice of someone who was going to tell you difficult truths whether you wanted to hear them or not, but who would at least do it kindly. "Because Elder Margot Blackwood has filed a formal inquiry about your presence here. She is calling it irregular. An unmated woman of common bloodline in a sovereign household with no formal contracted status beyond a verbal arrangement with Lord Kyle himself. She is using it as leverage." Bombo. A pause. Petra sipped her tea, giving Elena time to absorb this. "She is arguing," Petra continued, "that Lord Kale's continued refusal to select from the council's candidates suggests his judgment is compromised. That his personal attachments are interfering with his ability to make decisions that serve the territory's best interests. She wants the decision taken out of his hands. She wants the council to have the authority to select a mate for him and requires compliance." Elena set down her cup carefully, the porcelain meeting the saucer with a small, precise sound. "Can she do that?" "Not unilaterally," Petra said, "but if 3 senior elders agree, they can call for a governance review. It is a mechanism designed to prevent sovereigns from making catastrophically poor decisions, from leading their territories into ruin through incompetence or madness or corruption. It has been invoked exactly 7 times in the last 200 years, and 5 of those times it resulted in the sovereign being removed from power." Her voice was even, not alarmed, not dramatizing the situation. Petra was not the kind of woman who inflated facts to make them more interesting, which made the facts themselves heavier, more real, more impossible to dismiss as exaggeration. "And Margot has been building the alliances she would need for 2 years," Petra said. "She is patient and strategic and very good at making people believe that what she wants is what they want." "There is more," Petra added, and the particular quality of her voice suggested this next part was worse than what had come before. "The candidate the council favors most strongly is a woman named Isolde Brennan. Her family controls the eastern border routes, the primary trade corridors between Blackpine and the territories to the south and east. An alliance with the Brennan line would be strategically significant. It would stabilize trade, prevent the kind of disruptions that happened 3 years ago when the southern routes were blocked for 6 months over a territorial dispute. It would make Blackpine wealthier and more secure." "Then it makes sense," Elena said. "Politically it makes sense. A sovereign should choose what serves the territory, not what serves himself." "It makes sense on paper," Petra said. What makes less sense is that Lord Kyle met Isolde 4 times last spring, formal meetings arranged by the council, and found reason to decline each time. And what makes even less sense than that is that since you arrived, he has eaten dinner in the family room every single night instead of in his study, which is where he spent most evenings in the 2 years before you came. Elena looked at the woman across from her, at the careful neutrality of her expression that was not actually neutral, that was actually a kind of information being delivered in code. Petra, she said carefully, I came here for the children. I know that, Petra said. I am not certain everyone else does. And I am quite certain that Lord Kyle himself is not entirely certain what he came to Thornridge to ask you for, though he would not say so, not even to himself, if he could avoid it. She rose, smoothed her skirt with those same practiced hands, the gesture that meant difficult truths had been delivered, and now Elena could do with them what she would. I'm telling you this, Petra said, because you ought to know what's moving in the walls of this house before it moves in your direction. You've been in difficult situations before. You should have the information to navigate this one properly. She left. Elena sat with her cooling tea in the early evening light and thought about walls and what moved inside them, about councils and leverage, and the many ways that people who wanted power found to take it from people who thought they were safe. She was crossing the lower corridor toward the library 2 nights later when she heard the voices through the partially open door of the East Council room. A smaller meeting space used for private discussions rather than formal sessions, wood-paneled and intimate in a way the Great Hall could never be. She would have passed it entirely if her own name had not stopped her feet mid-stride, sudden and jarring enough that her body responded before her mind had fully processed what she was hearing. The Hartwell woman has no pack, standing no bloodline significance, no mating mark. That was Margot's voice, precise and uninflected, as always the voice of someone reading from a prepared statement rather than speaking extemporaneously. Her presence here creates a perception problem regardless of the stated purpose. It suggests favoritism. It suggests that you are making decisions based on personal preference rather than territorial necessity. The stated purpose is my children. Kale's voice quieter than Margot's, but with a specific quality that Elena had learned to recognize over 11 days. Not anger, not defensiveness. The tone of someone who had decided where his line was and was standing on it without apology or explanation. Your children need stability, Margot said, which a formally contracted sovereign mate would provide far better than a common woman, with no experience in courtly matters, no understanding of pack governance, no connections that would benefit the territory. My children ate full meals this week for the first time in 4 months. Kale's voice had not risen, had not changed in volume or intensity, but something in it had sharpened. All 3 of them together at the table without anyone being coaxed or reasoned with or bribed into eating. That did not happen with 4 previous arrangements, Elder Margot, including the one your council selected. A pause that had weight in it, the kind of silence that was actually a statement being made. The Brennan Alliance is a trade agreement dressed in ceremony, Kale said, and you know it. You are asking me to bond with a woman I do not want, and who does not want me, in order to secure routes that we could secure through simple negotiation if anyone on this council was interested in doing the actual work of diplomacy rather than treating mating bonds like political currency. You cannot run a sovereignty on sentiment, Margot said, and her voice had cooled. Several degrees moved into the register she used when she was done pretending to be reasonable and was ready to issue ultimatums. I'm not running it on sentiment, Kale said. I'm running it on the observation that my daughter spoke 12 sentences at dinner last evening, which is 11 more than she spoke at any dinner in the previous month. I track what matters. I pay attention to the things that actually indicate whether my household is functioning or failing. And right now it is functioning better than it has in 3 years. That is not sentiment. That is data. Silence. Elena pressed her back against the stone wall of the corridor, the cold seeping through her dress, her heart doing complicated things in her chest that felt less like beating and more like something trying to break free. 12 sentences. She had not counted. She had not been keeping score or tracking metrics or treating Bryn's gradual opening as something to be measured and quantified. She had just been talking to the girl the way you talk to someone who was worth talking to, which meant not performing for them or trying to extract responses, but simply being present in their vicinity and seeing what happened. The council will expect a formal answer within the fortnight. Margot said, her footsteps already moving toward the door. The council will have it, Kale said. Elena moved back into the shadowed alcove beside the quarter tapestry, a hunting scene rendered in faded colors that had probably been bright once but had dulled over decades of torchlight and smoke. She pressed herself against the wall and waited for Margot's sharp profile to pass through the doorway and disappear toward the main hall, her boot heels clicking against stone with the particular rhythm of someone who believed she was winning. Elena breathed. 12 sentences, the council in 3 days, an inquiry about her presence, leverage being built and deployed against a man who had offered her protection and asked nothing in return except that she care about his children, which she had not meant to do, but had done anyway because they were small and serious and still learning how to exist in a world that had taken their mother from them. She stepped back into the corridor. The council room door was still partially open. She should have continued to the library. She knew that. She should have pretended she had heard nothing, should have carried on with her evening, and let the politics of sovereigns and councils remain in the realm where they belonged, separate from her temporary position in a household that was not hers. She pushed the door slightly wider instead. Cale was standing at the window on the far side of the room, back to the door looking out at the dark courtyard where the pear tree was a shadow against the torch-lit wall. He had heard her, she had no doubt about that. Wolf hearing being what it was acute enough to pick up heartbeats from across a room, he had probably heard her footsteps in the corridor before she had heard the voices through the door. But he did not turn immediately, and she understood that this was a kind of courtesy, giving her time to decide whether she actually wanted to enter or whether she wanted to retreat and pretend this conversation was not happening. "How much did you hear?" he said to the window, to his reflection in the dark glass. "Enough," Elena said. He turned then, and in the low candle light of the council room, she could see that he looked tired in a way she had not seen before. Not physically diminished, not weakened, but carrying something that had been carried for a long time and was getting heavier with each passing day. The weight of being responsible for too many things, of making decisions that affected too many lives, of trying to balance what the council wanted with what he needed, with what the children required. "I should apologize," he said, "for the position my council's interference may put you in. You came here for a specific purpose, and you should not have to navigate political complications that have nothing to do with you." "I can handle uncomfortable positions," Elena said. "I've had practice." Something shifted at the edge of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the territory just before it, the suggestion of one held in reserve. "I don't doubt it." She stood in the doorway, and he stood by the window, and the candles burned between them, and outside the pear tree stood in the dark courtyard, catching no light and bearing no fruit this late in the season. "Why did you decline the Brennan candidates 4 times?" she asked. It was not her business. She knew that, but she asked anyway because she had heard him defend her to Margot, and that defense had earned him the right to a direct question. He considered her for a moment the way he considered most things, not evasively, but with the specific patience of someone who wanted to answer correctly rather than quickly. "Because they were chosen by people who were optimizing for the wrong things," he said. "Land, roots, alliance, math, strategic advantage measured in trade agreements and border security. All of it important, all of it worth considering. But none of it was about what my children actually need, which is not a political alliance. They need someone who looks at them and sees them. Not what they represent, not what they will become, not what advantages their bloodline might bring, or what connections their future mating might secure. What they are right now." He stopped, and in that stopping, she could see him deciding whether to finish the thought. "Small," Elena said quietly, and very serious about it. This time the shift at the corner of his mouth completed itself briefly and entirely. A real smile, fast and genuine and gone, almost as soon as it appeared. "Yes." The candle nearest the window guttered in a draft that came from somewhere, some gap in the stone that let the cold mountain air seep in. It steadied the flame, catching again, throwing shadows across the wall. Elena became aware in a peripheral way she had been successfully ignoring for 11 days that the room was small, and he was standing in it, and that his presence had a particular quality. Not aggressive, not performed, not the kind of dominance that some men wore like armor and used like a weapon, but there in the way that very few people were, simply and completely there. Present without needing to announce it. Solid in a way that had nothing to do with physical size and everything to do with the specific gravity of someone who knew exactly who they were and did not need anyone else's confirmation. She looked away first, looked at the tapestry on the wall behind him, a mountain scene with wolves running beneath a moon. "I came for the library," she said. "It's 2 doors down," he said. "I know. Good night, Elena." "Good night, Lord Cale." She went to the library. She selected a book without reading the spine. She sat in the chair nearest the fireplace and held it in her lap and did not read a single word of it for a very long time. It was on the 14th day that the letter arrived. Not found. It was given to her, which was worse. A rider arrived from Thornridge territory at mid-morning bearing pack correspondence, and among the documents sorted by Petra for relevant distribution was a sealed envelope addressed in an elder's hand to the Hartwell woman care of the Blackpine household. Petra brought it to Elena in the courtyard where she was sitting with the twins and their drawing materials, a collection of charcoal and colored pencils, and paper that Rowan had spread across the bench in what he insisted was an organized system, but which looked to Elena like controlled chaos. Bryn was drawing the pear tree with careful attention to the exact placement of each bare branch. Rowan was drawing what he claimed was a dragon, but which could equally have been a very angry dog. Something in Petra's expression suggested she already knew the contents were not pleasant. Perhaps the seal, which was Thornridge's formal administrative mark rather than a personal crest. Perhaps just the timing 2 weeks after Elena had left with no word sent ahead, no formal notification of her new position, nothing to satisfy the bureaucratic requirements of a pack that tracked its unmated women, with the kind of attention usually reserved for valuable livestock. Elena opened it after the children went inside for their afternoon lesson with the tutor, after Rowan had asked her 14 questions about whether dragons were real, and Bryn had shown her the drawing with a small nod that meant approval had been granted. It was from Elder Silas Brennan Thornridge's contracts administrator. Formal language official sealed a specific texture of bureaucratic inevitability rendered in careful script. It informed her that in her absence, the contracted union process had proceeded. A match had been selected. A man named Aldrich Stone, 43 years of age, a landholding beta from the Southern District, twice widowed, in need of a household manager and appropriate companionship as defined by pack law. She was expected to return to Thornridge within the fortnight to complete the agreement. Accommodations would be provided during the transition period. The ceremony would be brief and witnessed by the required number of elders to make it legally binding. Her refusal was not mentioned because her refusal was not a variable the system accounted for. You did not refuse a contracted union. You accepted it, and you made the best of it, and you lived the life that had been chosen for you by people who knew better than you did what was appropriate for someone of your standing. Elena read the letter twice. Then she folded it along its original creases and held it in both hands and looked at the pear tree that Rowan had climbed that morning while delivering a speech about the superior visibility available from high places, about how being up in the branches let you see things that people on the ground could not see, which was an advantage worth the risk of falling. She was not going to marry Aldrich Stone. She knew that with the same quiet certainty with which she knew other non-negotiable things about herself. Her name, her mother's face, the fact that marigolds smelled like pepper and sunshine, and that winter in the mountains tasted like metal on your tongue. But knowing what she would not do and knowing what she would do instead were different problems, and only one of them was solved. She was still sitting there when she heard boots on the courtyard stones behind her. She did not need to look. She had learned his footsteps by now, the particular rhythm of them even and unhurried. The rider brought pack correspondence. Kale said not a question. Yes. He came around to her side of the bench and looked briefly at the letter in her hands, and he waited with that same patient quality he brought to most things, giving her space to decide whether she wanted to share what it said or whether she wanted to keep it private. Contracted union, Elena said, keeping her voice level factual, the way you delivered information that was unpleasant but not surprising. From Thornridge, I'm expected back within the fortnight to complete the arrangement. She kept her eyes on the pear tree on the bare branches, reaching up toward the gray sky. So I suppose we'll need to discuss the arrangement here, she said, whether it continues or whether it ends, whether I leave now or whether I leave in 2 weeks after the month is complete. He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that had something behind it, something being considered and weighed. Yes, he said finally, we will. He sat down, not at the far end of the bench where he had sat in the garden at Thornridge, maintaining that careful distance between strangers who were being cautious with each other. Closer than that. Close enough that if either of them reached out their hands would meet in the middle of the stone bench between them. The space between them held 3 feet of cold autumn air, and neither of them moved to close it, and neither of them moved away. Above them, one last pear hung from the crooked branch of the tree gold, and slightly past its moment, the skin beginning to wrinkle with the first touches of frost. Still holding on. The conversation happened that evening, after the twins were in bed, after Rowan had extracted promises that Elena would watch him climb again tomorrow, and Bryn had shown her 3 more drawings without saying a word, just laying them out on the table for inspection. Kale came to the library where Elena had taken to spending her late hours, the fire burning low, and the room warm and quiet in a way that made thinking possible. He brought no pretense with him, no staff member positioned at the door to chaperone. No formal framing to make this about politics or contracts or anything except what it actually was which was two people trying to figure out how to navigate a situation that had become more complicated than either of them had anticipated. He sat across from her at the long table that dominated the center of the room and placed his hands flat on the dark wood between them. "I want to make the arrangement formal," he said, "not the household position. Something with more standing. Something that would supersede Thornridge's contracted union claim and give you protected status within Blackpine permanently. Something that would make it clear to every elder and council member and PAC administrator in the Northern Territories that you are not available for reassignment or reclamation." Elena looked at him across the table. The fire behind her threw warm light across the room, and outside the library window the night had turned cold enough that the glass had begun to fog at the edges, condensation forming in slow patterns. "You're describing a formal pairing," she said. "I am," he said, and held her gaze the way he held most things, directly and without flinching. "On paper. Formal. Recognized by PAC law with full autonomy on your side and no obligations beyond what you choose to take on. A marriage in name that would give you legal standing and protection and the right to refuse anyone who tries to claim authority over your choices." A pause. The fire crackled behind her. "But I want to be honest with you, Elena," he said, "because I think dishonesty is expensive and you've already paid too much of that cost in your life. It would not only be paper for me. I want you to know that going in. I want you to understand what you would be agreeing to from my perspective, even if the legal structure allows you to treat it as nothing more than convenient protection." The fire cracked again, a log splitting and settling deeper into the coals. She looked at the table between them, at his hands and her hands, and the few inches of dark wood that separated them. She thought about Marcus standing in her aunt's kitchen, saying, "I want it to be you," and meaning nothing by it, meaning less than nothing, because what he had actually meant was, "I want you to believe I want you until it becomes inconvenient for me to follow through." She thought about how the same words offered by different people could carry entirely different weights, could mean completely opposite things depending on who was speaking and what they were willing to stake on the truth of what they said. She thought about how she had become someone who checked the weight of things carefully now, who pressed them the way you press fruit at a market to test for ripeness, not from cynicism, but from the expensive knowledge that surface and substance were not always the same thing, that people said words all the time without backing them with anything real. She thought about Bryn bringing her a book without a word, about Rowan's beetle and his quartz and his extremely realistic wolf drawing pinned now to the wall above the writing desk in her room because he had given it to her formally and with great ceremony, and she had accepted it in the same spirit, understanding that small gestures from small people could carry more weight than grand promises from grown ones. She thought about 12 sentences at dinner. "I have conditions," she said. "Name them." "Name? I want to send a formal response to Thornridge, myself in my own words. I won't have it drafted by a council or signed as an administrative transfer. I left that territory under one set of circumstances, and I'll close it on my own terms. They don't get to write the ending of this particular story." "Done," he said without hesitation. "Anything else? If at any point the children are distressed by whatever shape this takes between us, we restructure without argument." They came first. That was the agreement. That doesn't change regardless of what legal documents we sign or what the council thinks about our arrangement. "That was already true," he said. "I wouldn't have it otherwise." She looked at him, the specific steadiness of him, not impassive and not closed, but anchored in a way she had not encountered in a person before. Present without pressure, decided without demand. The kind of person who said things and meant them and did not require constant verification that he still meant them a week later. "All right," she said. He exhaled, not dramatically, just the specific release of someone who had been carrying a held breath longer than they realized, letting it out now that the moment had passed and the decision had been made. "All right," he said. The formal documentation was drawn up over the following 2 days by Garrett Hayes, Blackpine's PAC administrator, a careful man in his mid-40s who wore small spectacles and had the manner of someone doing very precise work in uncertain conditions and finding it professionally satisfying. Elena read every line. She asked questions about 3 specific clauses and had 2 of them revised to her satisfaction. Garrett revised them without comment, which she appreciated more than if he had argued or tried to explain why the original language was better. She wrote her letter to Thornridge herself at the desk in her room with the window open to the cold orchard air and Rowan's wolf drawing observing from the wall where she had pinned it. She was not cruel in the letter because cruelty required a level of ongoing investment she had decided not to make, but she was clear. She released herself from the contracted union process, cited her formal status change under Blackpine PAC law, thanked Elder Silas for the administration of his duties, and signed her name without flourish. Petra read it over her shoulder uninvited and said, "Good," which was the highest form of praise Elena had yet heard from her. The writer left before noon with the letter sealed and addressed. Elder Margot Blackwood arrived the following morning with 2 council members, and the specific energy of someone who had received news they disliked and had organized their displeasure into a formal visit. Elena was in the courtyard with the twins when the delegation came through the main gate. She heard the horses before she saw them, the sound of hooves on cobblestones carrying in the cold air. She watched Kale cross from the main steps to meet them, moving with that same unhurried quality she had learned was not slowness, but choice. Every movement deliberate and at exactly the speed he intended. Rowan climbed higher in the pear tree, his preferred response to any situation that involved formal visitors. Bryn put down her book and watched with the kind of attention she gave to things she was cataloging for future reference. "Who are those people?" Rowan called down from his branch. "Council elders," Elena said. "They look annoyed." "They are. Are they annoyed about you?" Elena considered this. Honesty seemed appropriate. "Partly." Rowan thought about this, his face serious in the way of children processing complex adult situations through limited frameworks. "Father doesn't look worried," he observed. "No," Elena said. "He doesn't." Bryn, without looking up from where she had refocused on her book, said in her quiet, certain voice, "He won't let anything bad happen." It was stated without drama, without the performative reassurance of a child trying to comfort themselves or others. It was simply a fact, as Bryn understood, the world delivered with the kind of conviction that came not from naivety, but from careful, long observation of a person. The kind of trust that was earned rather than given. Elena looked at the side of the girl's face and felt something pull tight in her chest with a force she was not prepared for. The council meeting lasted 2 hours. Elena was not present for it. She was in the east sitting room with the twins working through a lesson on pack geography that had devolved with Rowan's enthusiastic assistance into a highly inaccurate but dramatically satisfying map of a fictional territory where wolves governed through a complex system of acorn-based currency and territorial disputes were resolved through climbing competitions. Bryn had drawn the map. It was extremely detailed, with mountain ranges labeled in her careful handwriting and a capital city that Rowan had named Acorn Haven with complete conviction. Petra appeared in the doorway at the end of the second hour with the expression of someone managing satisfaction, holding it carefully in place through professional discipline. "The council has acknowledged the formal documentation," she said. "Elder Margot has filed a procedural objection, which is her right. It will go to the Territorial Review Board and go nowhere, as procedural objections from single council members almost invariably do when the sovereign's documentation is in order." A pause. "Which it is." "And the Brennan Alliance," Elena asked, "tabled for separate negotiation decoupled from the mating question, which is how it should have been structured in the first place, and which Lord Kyle has apparently been saying for the better part of a year." Petra's tone carried the specific satisfaction of a woman who had been watching someone be right about something for a long time and was pleased to finally see that rightness acknowledged. "The Brennan family has in fact already sent word that they're willing to discuss trade terms directly." As it turns out, they were no more enthusiastic about the forced alliance than he was. Rowan, who had been listening from his position on the floor surrounded by map drawing materials, said, "What's Brennan?" "A territory to the east," Elena said. "Do they have good trees?" "I genuinely don't know." "I'll put trees on the map," he decided, and did, rendering them as a series of triangles along what he had labeled the eastern border of reasonable trade terms. Kale found her that evening in the orchard. She had gone out after dinner without particularly deciding to, drawn by the cold air and the specific quality of the late autumn dark, clear enough to see stars through the bare branches of the fruit trees, cold enough that her breath came visible in small clouds that dissipated almost as soon as they formed. She had her coat pulled close and her hands in her pockets, and she was standing under the pear tree, looking up at the last stubborn fruit still clinging to the highest branch when she heard him come through the side gate. He stopped a few feet away and looked up at the same pear, following her gaze to where it hung in the dark against the slightly lighter dark of the sky. "Council's been managed," he said. "Petra told me." "Good." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said in a voice that was careful in a way his voice was not usually careful, "Are you all right?" The question landed differently than she expected. Not, "Is everything in order?" or "Has this caused you difficulty?" but simply, "Are you all right?" direct and personal, and asking about her specifically rather than about the situation generally. "Yes," she said. And then, because it was true and because she had decided somewhere in the last 2 weeks to practice honesty as a discipline, as a choice she made deliberately rather than a default she fell into, "Better than I expected to be." He nodded. Above them, the last pair hung in the dark, visible only because they knew where to look for it. I should tell you something, he said, about why I was at the Thornridge ceremony in the first place. She turned slightly toward him, just enough to indicate she was listening. I wasn't there for the ceremony, he said. I was there for a border consultation with the Thornridge Council, trade routes, security, some questions about shared patrols in the disputed territories between our lands. The ceremony was incidental. Margot insisted I attend as a courtesy, said it would be seen as an insult if a visiting sovereign of my rank did not witness their traditions. And I sat in the gallery because refusing would have cost me political capital for no good reason. A pause. The cold air moved between the branches above them. I watched from the upper level, he said. I saw the full circle. I saw all of it. Elena looked back at the tree, at the dark branches against the dark sky. Then you saw Marcus. I call what he did, Cale said, and I saw you walk out. The cold settled deeper, the kind that came down from the high peaks at night and lived in the stones and the earth until the sun rose again to drive it back. I've been thinking about something, he continued with the care of someone choosing words for precision rather than effect. The bond. She went still. I felt it, he said simply, in the garden when I sat beside you. Not dramatically, not the way pack songs describe it all, fire and compulsion, and your wolf rising up to claim its mate, whether you wanted to or not. It was quieter than that, more like, he paused, searching for the right words. Certainty, the specific feeling of a question you didn't know you were asking being answered. Elena did not speak, could not speak. The air had become too thick for words. I'm not telling you this to press you, he said. I know what the word bond means to someone who has just passed over in a mating circle. I know it sounds like the same system that just it failed you dressed up differently. I'm telling you because you asked me to be honest going in, and this is part of going in, and you deserve to have all the information before you decide what this arrangement means to you. The last pair shifted in a breath of wind and held. Elena thought about destiny and the difference between destiny and choice. She thought about how a thing could be real and still need to be chosen, how recognition was not the same as decision, how feeling a bond was not the same as accepting it. She thought about Bryn's voice earlier that day, quiet and certain. He won't let anything bad happen. Delivered not as hope, but as accumulated evidence, the conclusion drawn from careful observation of a person's actions over time. I'm not ready, she said, for that word, for what it means. I know, he said. I might not be for a while. I'm not going anywhere, he said. In the particular quality of that statement, not a promise performed for effect, but a fact stated with the same steady certainty with which he stated all facts settled into the cold air between them and stayed there. She looked up at the last pair on the highest branch, gold against the dark. It's going to fall soon, she said. Before the first frost, he agreed. That's a shame. We'll plant another tree in the spring, he said. The twins have been campaigning for an apple. She laughed briefly and genuinely, the kind of laugh that surprised her by arriving. The sound went up through the bare branches and disappeared into the clear, cold dark above. They stood together under the tree for a while longer, not touching, not needing to. The night around them, patient and unhurried, and somewhere above them, the last pair held on with the particular stubbornness of things that were not yet finished. The document arrived on a Thursday in a courier's satchel, delivered not to Cale, but to Garrett Hayes, who read it twice with increasing stillness before carrying it directly to the library where Cale was working through territorial reports. Elena was not there when it arrived. She was in the schoolroom with the twins finishing the fictional territory map that had grown over 4 days into something requiring a second sheet of parchment and featuring 3 mountain ranges, a disputed border zone labeled the Acorn Wars Memorial Site, and a capital city that Rowan had expanded to include what he called essential dragon landing platforms. Bryn had drawn everything with meticulous attention to scale and proportion. It was, Elena thought, possibly the most detailed imaginary map she had ever seen. Petra came for her at mid-morning. Her face held that particular stillness Elena had come to recognize, the look of someone carrying news that required steady hands to deliver. Lord Cale is asking for you, Petra said. In the library. Elena set down her pen. Bryn looked up from the map, and something in the girl's face sharpened slightly, that perpetual, careful watching, focusing with laser precision on the small shifts in adult behavior that signaled changes in the weather. Finish the northern coastline, Elena told her. To Rowan, no more than 2 volcanoes, we discussed this. 3 would be more realistic, Rowan said, without looking up from where he was adding what appeared to be a sea serpent to the eastern waters. 2, Elena said, and followed Petra out. The document was spread open on the library table when she entered. Cale was standing beside it rather than sitting, which she had learned meant something. He sat when things were manageable, when they could be addressed through normal channels and ordinary effort. He stood when they required room to think, when the implications were large enough that sitting felt wrong. Garrett was positioned near the window with the manner of a man fulfilling a necessary professional function while trying to take up as little space as possible. He nodded to Elena when she entered, but said nothing. Elena crossed to the table and looked down. It was an archived document from Thornridge, stamped with the Elder Seal, dated 27 years prior. A bloodline registry entry, the kind that PACs maintain to track significant lineages and ensure proper recording of inherited traits and abilities. The paper had yellowed slightly at the edges, but the ink was still clear, the script careful and formal. She read the header line and stopped breathing. Hartwell Marin, bloodline classification, silver marked, maternal inheritance, lineage Thornridge, sovereign line, collateral branch, third generation removed. She read it again because the first time her eyes had moved over the words without her brain fully processing them, without the meaning settling into anything she could hold. Her mother's name, her mother's bloodline, a classification she had never heard applied to her family, had never been told about, had never been given any reason to suspect existed, because the people who held the records had made a specific and sustained choice not to tell her. Silver marked was not common. It was not ordinary PAC heritage that showed up in every third family. It was a bloodline designation tied to the oldest wolf families, the lines that carried heightened wolf sense. Prophetic instinct, the specific thread of awareness that manifested differently in each generation, but ran unbroken through certain bloodlines like a wire-carrying current. It was rare enough that PACs tracked it in registries, valuable enough that it mattered, politically significant enough that it changed what rights and status a person could claim. Her palms pressed against the table surface. She was aware of them distantly, the way you were aware of your body when shock had disconnected your mind from the ordinary sensory feedback that kept you grounded. "There's more," Cale said quietly. Garrett stepped forward and indicated a second document beneath the first newer different seal. Thornridge's contracts office, rather than the general archive. A record dated 18 years ago when Elena was 6. Record of bloodline suppression. Administrative reclassification. Authorized by Elder Silas Brennan, Elder Margot Blackwood, Elder Thaddeus Venn. Subject Elena Hartwell, daughter of Marin Hartwell, deceased. Original classification, silver mark sovereign collateral. Revised classification common. Justification administrative consolidation of minor collateral lines. Effective immediately. Elena read it. Then she read it again because the first time the words had assembled themselves into sentences, but not into meaning, not into something her mind could accept as real. The Thornridge elders had known, had always known. Her mother had presented the bloodline documentation herself when Elena was born, as PAC law required providing proof of lineage and classification, so it could be recorded in the official registries. The elders had classified it, stamped it, filed it in whatever archive held such things. And then through a mechanism, the document called administrative reclassification, but which was, in plain language, deliberate concealment, they had buried it, removed it from the active registry. Reclassified Elena's bloodline as common, made her on paper into someone with no particular standing or significance, someone whose mating could be controlled through ceremonies and contracted unions, someone who had no right to claim territory or position or the kind of autonomy that silver-marked sovereign collaterals were granted under PAC law. They had done this when she was 6 years old, and they had maintained it for 18 years. Through 3 ceremonies where she stood in circles and watched alphas pass her by, through the contracted union assignment, through every moment of her life when she had believed herself to be common and unremarkable and without particular value to anyone. The contracted union, Elena said. Her voice came out very steady, which she noted with distant, almost clinical interest. Aldrich Stone. His family holds a land claim that overlaps with territory your mother's bloodline would have entitled you to. Garrett said carefully, his voice gentle in the way of people delivering information they knew would hurt. A contracted union would have transferred your claim to him through the dissolution of your independent standing. Once you married him, anything you might have inherited would become his by default. Elena straightened up from the table. The room was quiet. Outside, distantly, she could hear Rowan's voice from the schoolroom, something about volcanoes and their strategic importance in fictional territorial defense. The sound was very ordinary and very far away. "They passed me in the circle 3 times, she said. Not a question, just working through it aloud because she needed to hear the logic and sequence, needed to understand how all the pieces fit together. Any alpha who recognized a silver-marked bond would have been advised by Thornridge's elders that your bloodline was common, Cale said. His voice was carefully controlled, the kind of control that meant he was angry and working very hard not to show it. Some of them may not have understood what they were being told to ignore. Others, he paused and she could see him deciding how much to say. Marcus Thorne's family has ties to Elder Silas going back 2 generations, he said. His father served on Silas's council for 15 years. The ground did not move under her feet. She had half expected it to some physical manifestation of the architecture of her life restructuring itself. But the floor was simply the floor and the table was the table, and the document was a piece of parchment that had made choices about her life 18 years ago without asking her permission. She thought about her mother who had died when Elena was 14, of a fever that had moved too quickly through the pack for the healers to contain, who had never in the time they had together given Elena any indication that there was something hidden, something suppressed, something that should have been hers but had been taken. She wondered now if her mother had known, if she had been complicit in the silence, or if she had been kept ignorant as well. If she had suspected and chosen not to fight, or if she had tried to fight and been defeated by a system that had more power than one woman could challenge alone. She would never be able to ask. "What are my options?" Elena said. Garrett and Cale exchanged a brief look, the kind that passed between people who had worked together long enough to communicate in glances. "The territorial claim can be formally reasserted," Garrett said. "The bloodline documentation is legitimate. The suppression record actually confirms its existence, which is somewhat self-defeating on the elders' part. You would need to file with the regional PAC authority rather than Thornridge's internal counsel. It would be public, it would be investigated, and given your current status under Blackpine's formal documentation and Lord Kael's standing the filing would carry significant weight." A pause. He adjusted his spectacles in the way he did when he was about to deliver information he knew would complicate matters. "And Silas Brennan?" Elena asked. "And the others who signed the suppression record?" "A suppression of registered bloodline documentation is a PAC law violation," Garrett said. "A serious one. It's considered fraud, corruption of official records, and abuse of elder authority. The regional authority would have jurisdiction to pursue it. There could be censure removal from position, potentially criminal charges, depending on what else the investigation uncovers." Elena looked at the document on the table at her mother's name in ink that was 27 years old and still true. Still real, still there waiting all this time to be found. "File it," she said. 3 days after the filing, Aldrich Stone arrived at Blackpine with a small Thornridge delegation. Elena was in the East Garden with the twins when Petra found her moving quickly enough that Elena knew before she spoke that something had changed, something was happening that required immediate attention. "Aldrich Stone is here," Petra said quietly, crouching to eye level so the children would not hear. "He arrived with 2 Thornridge enforcers. He is demanding an audience with Lord Kael, and he is demanding you be returned to fulfill contractual obligations." Elena's hands stilled on the drawing she had been examining, one of Bryn's careful renderings of the orchard in winter. "Where is Lord Kael?" "Main hall," Petra said. "He sent me to tell you that you have a choice. You can stay here with the children and he will handle this, or you can come and face this man yourself. He will support either decision without question." Elena looked at Bryn, who was watching with that careful attention that missed nothing. At Rowan, who had stopped adding details to his dragon and was looking between the adults with the dawning awareness that something was wrong. "Stay with Rowan," Elena said to Bryn. To Petra, "I'm coming." She stood and walked toward the main hall, her heart steady, her mind clear, in the way it became when choices narrowed down to simple yes or no, stay or go, accept or refuse. Aldrich Stone stood in the center of the hall with 2 men flanking him, all 3 in Thornridge colors. He was weathered in the way of men who spent their lives working land, his face lined and hard, his posture carrying the territorial bearing of someone who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. Kael stood with Garrett near the far wall, positioned so he could see both the entrance and the visitors, his expression neutral in the way that meant he was being very careful about what he allowed to show. Aldrich saw Elena enter, and his expression shifted into something like satisfaction. "Miss Hartwell," he said, as if they were acquaintances meeting at a market rather than strangers connected only by bureaucratic assignment. "Your presence is required in Thornridge to complete our arrangement. I've come to escort you back personally to ensure there are no further delays." Elena walked forward until she was level with Kael, until she could feel his presence beside her like a wall at her back. "There is no arrangement, Mr. Stone," she said, her voice clear and cold and carrying in the stone hall. "I sent formal dissolution to Elder Silas 3 weeks ago. I am under Blackpine protection with documented formal status. Your claim is void." Aldrich's face darkened. "A woman's refusal doesn't dissolve a council-approved contract. The elders made the match. You are obligated to honor it." Elena stepped forward, one deliberate step that put her closer to him, then was comfortable close enough that he had to look slightly down to meet her eyes. A woman with silver-marked bloodline and sovereign collateral standing has full autonomy under pack law, she said. My refusal is the only thing that matters. The council had no authority to contract a union for someone of my classification. They knew that, which is why they suppressed my bloodline record for 18 years. Aldrich went very still. Silver-marked. You were registered common. Silas showed me the records himself. Those records were falsified, Elena said. The suppression is currently under investigation by the Regional PAC Authority, as is the question of why my contracted union assignment just happened to transfer my maternal territorial inheritance to your family through marriage. That's conspiracy to defraud bloodline rights, Mr. Stone. It's also under investigation. She watched him process this, watched the calculations happening behind his eyes as he tried to determine if she was bluffing, if this was some desperate play to avoid a match she didn't want. You have 3 minutes to leave Black Pine territory, Kale said from behind her, his voice quiet and absolute. If you return without formal invitation, you will be detained and held for the regional authorities' inquiry. Your choice. Aldrich looked between them at Elena's unwavering stare and Kale's implacable presence at Garrett, with his careful documentation and the legal weight of Black Pine behind every word. He saw what was there, an alpha king, a formally recognized sovereign mate, a woman with legal standing and the will to use it. He left without another word, his enforcers following, and the sound of horses faded into the distance beyond the gate. Elena's hands were shaking when they were gone, adrenaline finally catching up to what she had just done. Are you all right? Kale asked quietly. I've never done that before, she said. Stood up to someone like that, refused someone with that kind of certainty. You were formidable, he said, and there was something in his voice that might have been pride. I was terrified. Terrified looks good on you. She laughed breathless and slightly unsteady, and for the first time since the arrangement began, she let him hold her. Just briefly, just his hand on her shoulder, grounding and solid, and asking nothing more than to be allowed to offer that small comfort. The regional PAC authorities' response came 10 days later, which Garrett said was unusually fast and which was itself information. It suggested, he explained, that Thornridge's elders had accumulated enough complaints and irregularities over the years that a well-documented formal filing had landed on already prepared ground. The letter was formal but clear. Elena's bloodline classification was verified and corrected in the official registries. The suppression was confirmed as a PAC law violation. Elder Silas Brennan and his 2 co-signatories were placed under immediate governance review. A formal hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks hence, and Elena's presence was requested to provide testimony. Margot Blackwood's procedural objection was dismissed with a note citing conflict of interest, and she was removed from her council seat, pending further investigation into her knowledge of and participation in the suppression. The territorial claim was upheld in preliminary review. A small parcel of land on Thornridge's southern border, not large, not strategically vital to anyone, except the people who had spent 18 years making sure Elena never knew she held it. It was formally registered in her name. Elena stood in the library holding the confirmation document and felt the specific texture of justice, which was not triumphant in the way she might have imagined as a younger woman. It was quieter than that, more like a long-held breath, finally completed a weight she had not known she was carrying because she had never known it had been placed on her. She cried briefly alone in the library, and then she washed her face and went to find the twins. The formal hearing 3 weeks later was thorough and public and exactly as uncomfortable as Elena had anticipated. She testified about growing up believing she was common about 3 ceremonies where she was passed over about the contracted union assignment. Kale testified about what he had observed at the ceremony, about Marcus's stride slowing, about the glance toward Margot in the gallery, about a hand placed on Iris Vale's shoulder after eyes shifted left. And then at Elena's request, Marcus Thorne was called as a witness. He confirmed what Elena had suspected. Elder Silas had told him 2 days before the ceremony that Elena was common bloodline and that a match with her would be poor for his family's standing. Silas had suggested Iris Vale specifically mention her family's land holdings, the advantages of the connection. And Marcus had followed that suggestion, despite feeling the pull of recognition toward Elena, because he had trusted that the elder knew something he did not, because his family had served under Silas for 2 generations, and that loyalty ran deep. He apologized. His voice broke slightly when he said it, when he looked at Elena across the formal hearing chamber and said he was sorry that he had been wrong, that he understood now what he had cost her. Elena did not respond, did not nod, did not accept, did not absolve. She simply looked at him until he looked away, because she did not owe him forgiveness and closure did not require his participation. The panel deliberated for 2 hours and returned with findings. Silas Brennan and his co-signatories were stripped of their titles, barred from PAC service permanently, and faced potential criminal charges as the investigation continued into the full extent of their corruption. Margot Blackwood resigned her council seat before her formal hearing concluded and retired to her family's eastern estate. The Brennan family sent a trade proposal to Blackpine properly structured as a commercial negotiation rather than a mating arrangement. Elena's territorial claim was fully settled and registered. That evening, Elena found Kyle in the orchard where the pear tree stood bare against the winter sky. "The confirmation came this morning," she said. "I know. How do you feel?" "Like something was given back," she said, "and like I'm not entirely sure what to do with the person I am now that it has been." "Then you're the same person," he said. "You just have the record to prove it." She looked at him, at the steadiness that had become familiar, at the presence that no longer felt like something she was navigating around, but something she was choosing to move toward. "Kale," she said, "I'm ready for that word, for what it means." The bond settled between them like a key in a lock that had always been there, and Elena felt for the first time in a very long time exactly as large as she actually was. They were bonded before the winter solstice, in a small ceremony with no political delegation, just the PAC's senior members, and Petra in the front row, looking professionally satisfied, and the twins on the front bench clean for once. Rowan cried and denied it loudly. Bryn watched with clear, settled recognition, and afterward took Elena's hand and held it, and did not let go for a very long time. In spring, they planted an apple tree. Rowan supervised with extreme seriousness, delivering a speech about optimal root depth and proper soil composition that he had clearly memorized from the gardener. Bryn documented everything in her sketchbook, adding the sapling to her drawing of the orchard with the same careful attention she brought to all her art. The pear tree put out new growth in April, which Rowan declared a miracle, and Bryn declared predictable, and both of them were right in their own way. 6 months after the bonding, Elena stood in the healer's office receiving confirmation of what she had already suspected. When she told Kyle, placing his hand on her stomach that was not yet showing, his eyes went wide and then soft, and he pulled her close and whispered "thank you" against her hair. Rowan was ecstatic and immediately began planning a treehouse for the baby, explaining in great detail why the baby would need a treehouse, even though babies could not climb. Bryn created a detailed list of things the baby would need to know, written in her careful hand: which guards were kindest, where mother kept the good books, how to find the best climbing tree, why you should always eat your bread first at breakfast. One afternoon in late spring, Elena found the list on Bryn's desk and sat on the edge of the bed reading it, her hand on her growing belly, and cried the good kind of crying. Above them, the pear tree held its spring blossoms like quiet promises. The apple tree, younger and still uncertain, reached its first tentative branches toward the sun. And beneath both, in the turned earth, where they planted a cherry tree for the child to come, a family stood together, not bound by fate alone, but by choice made and remade day after day, season after season. The silver mark had given Elena her name back, but this, the life built from that reclaimed ground, was hers by right of something deeper, the particular grace of being seen and choosing to be seen in return.